Her cruel stepmother sold her like cattle in the town square because her womb was barren, until a mysterious rancher with 3 orphaned children and eyes full of grief paid twice the asking price and rode away without saying a word. What happened next in the dusty frontier town of Copper Ridge would become a legend whispered around campfires for generations. The Arizona Territory in 1887 was a land where survival meant everything and weakness meant nothing. In the sprawling cattle town of Copper Ridge, where the desert wind carried the constant smell of dust and desperation, reputation was more valuable than gold, and scandal spread faster than wildfire.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
For 22-year-old Isabella Marie Crenshaw, both of these truths were about to collide with devastating force. Isabella had once been the pride of Copper Ridge's small but ambitious social circle. The daughter of successful cattle broker William Crenshaw, she had grown up in the finest house on Prosperity Street, with servants, silk dresses imported from San Francisco, and the expectation that she would marry well and produce the next generation of frontier aristocracy. Her beauty was legendary throughout the territory: auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper, emerald eyes that could make grown men stutter, and a grace that seemed impossible in a land where most women aged before their time. At 18, she had married Jonathan Westbrook, heir to one of the largest cattle empires in the Southwest. The wedding had been the social event of the decade, with guests traveling from as far as Denver and San Antonio to witness the union of 2 prominent families. The dress, ordered from Paris and transported across 2 oceans and a continent, had cost more than most families earned in 5 years. The celebration lasted 3 days, with enough whiskey and beef to feed half the territory. But fairy tales, Isabella learned, had a way of turning into nightmares in the harsh reality of frontier life. The first year of marriage had been challenging but hopeful. Jonathan was kind enough, though distant, and his sprawling ranch house offered every comfort that money could buy in the middle of nowhere. Isabella threw herself into the role of rancher's wife, learning to manage a household staff, organize social gatherings for business associates, and present herself as the perfect frontier lady. She embroidered, played piano, spoke French, and maintained the kind of refined conversation that impressed visiting cattle buyers and territorial officials. As months passed without the hope for pregnancy, the atmosphere in the Westbrook household began to change. Jonathan's mother, Margaret Westbrook, had never fully approved of her son's choice of bride, considering Isabella too pampered and decorative for the serious business of building a cattle dynasty. The older woman's disapproval transformed into outright hostility as Isabella failed to produce the grandson she demanded. The second year brought increasingly desperate attempts to conceive. Isabella consulted every doctor within 100 miles, tried every folk remedy suggested by well-meaning neighbors, and prayed until her knees bled from kneeling on the rough wooden floor of the local church. She swallowed bitter herbal concoctions that made her violently ill, endured painful examinations by frontier physicians with questionable credentials, and submitted to treatments that ranged from uncomfortable to humiliating. Nothing worked. By the 3rd year, Jonathan's patience had worn as thin as his mother's tolerance. The couple barely spoke except when necessary for public appearances. Isabella spent her days in increasingly isolated silence, wandering the empty rooms of the ranch house like a ghost, watching through windows as other women in town pushed baby carriages down the dusty streets she was no longer welcome to walk. The end came with brutal suddenness. Isabella discovered Jonathan's plan through a conversation she wasn't meant to overhear. Hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains in his study, she listened in growing horror as her husband discussed his future with his mother and the family lawyer. "The marriage has served its purpose politically," Margaret Westbrook declared in her imperious voice. "The Thornfield connection opened doors we needed. But Isabella has proven herself useless for the primary function of a wife. We need heirs, not decorations. Divorce carries social complications, the lawyer observed cautiously, particularly given the prominent families involved. Then we'll handle it differently, Jonathan replied, his voice carrying a coldness Isabella had never heard before. Biblical precedent supports a man putting aside a barren wife. I'll arrange for her to return to her father's house, and will quietly dissolve the marriage. Within 6 months, I can remarry someone more, suitable. Isabella's world shattered as completely as if the adobe walls had collapsed around her. The man she had tried desperately to please, the family she had struggled to satisfy, the social position she had worked so hard to maintain, all of it was being stripped away, because her body had failed to perform its most basic expected function. Confrontation that followed was brief and devastating. Jonathan showed no emotion as he explained that their marriage would be annulled on grounds of her inability to fulfill her wifely duties. She would return to her father's house within the week, taking only her personal belongings and the horse she had brought to the marriage. No financial settlement, no continued support, no consideration for the woman who had spent 4 years trying to become everything he wanted. "I'm sorry, Isabella," he said with the same tone he might use to dismiss a failed ranch hand. "This isn't personal, it's simply business." Returning to her childhood home should have offered some comfort, but Isabella discovered that tragedy had transformed her father's house into something unrecognizable. William Crenshaw had remarried 2 years earlier, taking as his wife a woman named Cordelia Blackwood, a widow from back east who had arrived in Copper Ridge with her own ambitious plans and a complete lack of sympathy for anyone who stood in her way. Cordelia was everything Isabella's gentle mother had not been. Where Eleanor Crenshaw had been soft-spoken and kind, Cordelia was sharp-tongued and calculating. Where Eleanor had run the household with quiet efficiency and genuine care for the staff, Cordelia ruled through fear and manipulation. Most importantly, where Eleanor had loved her daughter unconditionally, Cordelia saw Isabella as nothing more than an expensive burden and a potential threat to her own position. The woman who greeted Isabella at the front door of her childhood home was dressed in black silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Cordelia's face was handsome in a severe way, with sharp cheekbones and pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they surveyed. Her graying hair was pulled back in a style so tight it appeared to stretch the skin around her temples, and her mouth was set in a permanent expression of disapproval. "So," Cordelia said without preamble, "the failed wife returns." Isabella stood on the porch where she had played as a child, holding a single carpetbag that contained everything she now owned in the world. Behind her, the driver who had brought her from the Westbrook Ranch was already climbing back onto his wagon, eager to escape what was clearly an uncomfortable situation. "I've come home," Isabella said quietly, trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. "This is my home now," Cordelia corrected coldly. "You are here on sufferance, and only because your father's misguided sentimentality prevents him from making the practical decisions necessary for this family's survival." Inside the house, Isabella discovered that Cordelia had wasted no time in erasing every trace of her predecessor. The warm, comfortable rooms where Isabella had grown up were now decorated in stark, expensive furnishings that seemed designed more to impress than to comfort. Her mother's portrait had been removed from the main hallway and replaced with a severe landscape that matched Cordelia's personality. Even the familiar smell of her childhood, a mixture of beeswax, rosewater, and the faint scent of her mother's lavender sachets, had been replaced by something harsh and medicinal. William Crenshaw had aged dramatically in the 2 years since Isabella had seen him. Once a robust man who commanded respect through both physical presence and business acumen, he now appeared diminished, his shoulders stooped, and his eyes holding a defeated quality that broke Isabella's heart. When he embraced her in his study,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
She felt how thin he had become beneath his expensive clothes. "I'm sorry about the marriage, Isabella," he said quietly, his voice lacking the confidence she remembered. "Jonathan sent word about the circumstances. You'll always have a place here, of course." But even as he spoke, Isabella could see the doubt in his eyes. The cattle business was struggling, territorial politics were unstable, and maintaining appearances required significant resources. An unmarried daughter with a failed marriage and a reputation for barrenness was not an asset any frontier family could easily afford. Cordelia made sure Isabella understood her position from the very first evening. At dinner, served in the formal dining room that had once been filled with laughter and comfortable conversation, the new mistress of the house outlined the rules that would govern Isabella's residence. "You will take your meals in the kitchen with the staff," Cordelia announced, cutting her beef with precise, deliberate movements. "You will assist with household duties as assigned. You will not entertain visitors or participate in social gatherings that might remind people of your situation. And you will contribute to this household's expenses through whatever work you can find that doesn't embarrass this family further." Isabella's father said nothing, staring at his plate with the expression of a man who had learned that resistance was futile. The months that followed were a systematic campaign of humiliation designed to break Isabella's spirit and drive her from the house. Cordelia assigned her the most menial tasks: scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, hauling water from the well, and tending to the livestock. When Isabella completed these tasks without complaint, more were added. When she maintained her dignity despite the degrading work, Cordelia found new ways to remind her of her failures. "Perhaps you should thank God every day that you're barren," Cordelia would say with false sweetness. "At least you'll never have to worry about disappointing children the way you've disappointed everyone else." The social isolation was perhaps worse than the physical labor. Isabella had once been invited to every important event in Copper Ridge, but now she was persona non grata. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, afraid that association with a failed wife might damage their own reputations. The church ladies who had once competed for her attention now whispered behind their fans when she passed, their conversations stopping abruptly when she came within earshot. But Cordelia's cruelest weapon was hope. Just when Isabella thought she had found her new place in the world, just when she had begun to accept her reduced circumstances, her stepmother would dangle the possibility of change. There would be hints about potential suitors, suggestions that the right marriage might restore her position, offers to help arrange meetings with widowers or older men who might overlook her. Unfortunate history. These offers always came with conditions. Isabella would need to dress appropriately, which meant borrowing money for new clothes. She would need to present herself properly, which required lessons in subjects that Cordelia claimed she had forgotten during her marriage. Most importantly, she would need to demonstrate her gratitude through increased devotion to household duties and complete submission to Cordelia's authority. The suitors, when they materialized at all, were inevitably inappropriate old men looking for nurses, drunkards seeking someone to manage their debts, or social climbers hoping to gain access to the Crenshaw family connections. Each meeting was an exercise in humiliation, with Isabella paraded before men who examined her like livestock while discussing her failings as if she weren't present. One particularly painful evening involved a meeting with Jeremiah Polk, a successful but crude rancher in his 60s who had buried 3 wives and was looking for a 4th. Cordelia had arranged the dinner with great ceremony, insisting that this might be Isabella's chance to redeem herself. "Pretty enough, I suppose," Polk observed, studying Isabella across the dinner table while she tried to maintain her composure. "But damaged goods from what I hear. Can't have children, lost her first husband, living on charity. What exactly am I getting for my investment?" Cordelia smiled with false warmth. Isabella has learned humility, Mr. Polk. She understands her circumstances and would be grateful for the opportunity to serve a man of your standing. Serve is right, Polk chuckled, his intentions unmistakable. I'm not looking for a wife, exactly. More like a housekeeper who warms my bed and doesn't cause trouble. Can you guarantee she understands that? Isabella excused herself from the table and spent the night vomiting behind the woodshed, her body's physical response to the emotional degradation she had endured. The breaking point came in the summer of 1887, when Copper Ridge was experiencing one of its periodic economic downturns. Cattle prices had dropped, several local businesses had failed, and even established families were feeling financial pressure. William Crenshaw's health was deteriorating, and his business judgment seemed to deteriorate with it. Isabella discovered the extent of her father's financial troubles when she overheard a heated conversation between him and Cordelia in his study. Hidden in the hallway outside, she listened in growing horror as her stepmother outlined the family's desperate situation. "The bank is threatening foreclosure on the ranch property," Cordelia said, her voice carrying none of its usual composure. "The business debts are mounting, and your health isn't improving enough for you to manage things properly. We need cash, and we need it quickly." "I can sell some of the cattle," William replied weakly. "Maybe take a loan against the property in town." "That's not enough, and you know it," Cordelia snapped. "We need a more permanent solution. Something that eliminates expenses while generating immediate income." There was a long pause before William spoke again, his voice barely audible. "What are you suggesting?" "Your daughter is 22 years old, physically healthy despite her limitations, and still attractive enough to command a good price. There are men in this territory who would pay handsomely for a woman with her breeding and education, even if she can't bear children." Isabella's blood turned to ice as she realized what her stepmother was proposing. "You're talking about selling." "My daughter," William said, his voice filled with horror. "I'm talking about finding her a situation that benefits everyone involved," Cordelia replied coldly. "She's a burden here, William. She contributes nothing, costs us money we don't have, and serves as a constant reminder of failure. There are opportunities for women like her, wealthy men who want companions, mining operations that need educated women to manage their books, even establishments that cater to discerning gentlemen who appreciate refinement." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Cordelia's planning. She had already been in contact with various potential buyers, had researched the legal requirements for what amounted to indentured servitude, and had calculated exactly how much money Isabella's sale would generate. "Think of it as arranging a marriage," Cordelia continued with false reasonableness. "Except instead of a dowry going with her, money comes to us. It's not uncommon in this territory, William. Half the women in mining camps and cattle towns started out as purchased companions. At least Isabella would be going to someone who can afford to treat her well." William's resistance crumbled over the following weeks as his health declined and the financial pressure increased. Isabella watched her father transform from a man struggling with a difficult decision into someone who had accepted the inevitable. The change was heartbreaking, but she understood that he was as much a victim of circumstances as she was. Cordelia handled the arrangements with businesslike efficiency. She placed discreet advertisements in territorial newspapers, corresponded with potential buyers, and arranged for Isabella to be examined by a doctor who could certify her health and verify her unfortunate inability to bear children, a detail that would actually increase her value to certain buyers who wanted companionship. Without the complications of potential pregnancy, the examination was the most humiliating experience of Isabella's life. Dr. Hartwell, an elderly physician who had delivered her as a baby, was forced to perform an intimate examination while Cordelia stood nearby asking clinical questions about Isabella's condition. The doctor's obvious discomfort and whispered apologies couldn't diminish the degradation of being examined like livestock. "She's healthy," Dr. Hartwell reported to Cordelia afterward, his voice flat with professional detachment. "Well-formed, no signs of disease, and confirmed barren. She'll serve whatever purpose her buyer intends." The final weeks before the sale were a blur of preparation and growing desperation. Isabella considered running away, but where could she go? A single woman with no money, no connections, and a reputation that preceded her had few options in the harsh frontier territory. She thought about contacting Jonathan or even Margaret Westbrook, but her pride wouldn't allow her to beg from the people who had discarded her. Instead, she spent her remaining time trying to prepare mentally for whatever fate awaited her. She had no illusions about the kind of men who purchased women in frontier territories. Her education and refinement might earn her better treatment than some, but she would still be property, owned and controlled by someone who saw her as an investment rather than a person. The morning of the sale dawned clear and hot, with the kind of merciless Arizona sun that bleached color from everything it touched. Isabella dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a blue cotton gown that had once been fashionable but now showed signs of wear and repeated mending. Cordelia had insisted she look presentable without appearing too prosperous, a balance that would maximize her appeal while justifying the sale. The market square, in Copper Ridge, was located at the intersection of the town's two main streets, surrounded by the businesses that served the surrounding ranches and mining operations. On this particular Saturday morning, it was crowded with the usual mix of ranchers, miners, townspeople, and drifters who gathered for the weekly trading of livestock, goods, and services. Isabella had attended countless market days as a child, delighting in the energy and excitement of commerce. Now she walked through the crowd knowing that she was about to become just another commodity for sale. Cordelia had arranged for the transaction to be handled by Marcus Webb, a man who specialized in what he euphemistically called domestic placements. Webb was a small, nervous man with thinning hair and clothes that had seen better days, but his reputation for discretion and efficiency made him valuable to families facing desperate circumstances. "Now, Miss Crenshaw," Webb said in his oily voice, "we want to present you to your best advantage. Stand straight, keep your eyes down modestly, and let me handle all the negotiations. Remember, this is for your own good as much as your family's." A small crowd gathered as word spread that William Crenshaw's daughter was being offered for placement. Some came out of genuine interest in acquiring a refined woman for legitimate purposes. Others were simply curious about the fall of a once prominent family. A few were there for darker reasons, drawn by the opportunity to acquire someone from their social betters. "Gentlemen," Webb announced in his practiced auctioneer's voice, "we have here a rare opportunity. Miss Isabella Crenshaw, daughter of one of our town's most respected families, educated, refined, and available for the right situation. She's healthy, attractive, and experienced in managing a household. Her unfortunate inability to bear children makes her ideal for certain specialized arrangements." Isabella stood in the center of the gathering, her cheeks burning with shame, as men examined her like a piece of livestock. Some made crude comments about her appearance, others asked clinical questions about her health and abilities, and a few engaged in the kind of speculation that made her stomach turn. The bidding began at $50, a sum that would have bought a good horse or a month's supplies for a small ranch. Isabella closed her eyes and tried to disappear into herself as the price climbed, each increase representing another degree of her objectification. $65, called out a voice she recognized as belonging to Samuel Morrison, a mining foreman known for his rough treatment of the women who worked in his establishments. $75, countered another man, this one a stranger whose expensive clothes and calculating eyes suggested he had traveled from outside the territory specifically for this opportunity. As the bidding continued, Isabella felt herself fragmenting into pieces. Part of her observed the proceedings with detached horror, as if watching someone else's tragedy unfold. Another part raged against the injustice of her situation, the cruelty of a world that could reduce a human being to a financial transaction. A third part simply wished for the ordeal to end. Regardless of the outcome, the crowd was beginning to thin as the price reached levels that eliminated casual bidders. Isabella found herself looking at the faces of the remaining men, trying to guess which one would own her in a few minutes. Each possibility filled her with a different kind of dread. Then something unexpected happened that would change everything. A new voice cut through the chatter of the crowd, deep and quiet, but carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look. From the back of the gathered men, a figure stepped forward that Isabella had never seen before, though his presence seemed to command immediate respect from those who recognized him. The man was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the desert sun. His clothes were simple but well-made denim pants, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest that showed signs of practical use rather than ornamentation. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, but Isabella could see enough of his face to notice the deep lines around his mouth, and the gray threading through his dark hair. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Even from a distance, even shadowed by his hat brim, they held a quality she hadn't seen in anyone else's gaze that morning. Not calculation, not hunger, not the cold evaluation of a man examining potential property. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw her as a person rather than a commodity. $100, the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. The bid was so much higher than the current price that it effectively ended the auction. No one else could or would match such an offer for what everyone understood to be a woman with significant limitations. Webb looked around hopefully for counterbids, but the crowd was already beginning to disperse. "Going once," he called out. "Hopefully, going twice." He paused, scanning the faces of the remaining men. "Sold to the gentleman for $100. Isabella felt her knees go weak as the reality of her situation finally struck her. She had been sold. She was now the property of a complete stranger who had paid twice what anyone else was willing to offer. She had no idea what he wanted from her, where he would take her, or what her life would become. As the stranger approached to complete the transaction, Isabella got her first clear look at the man who now owned her. He was older than she had initially thought, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of lean strength that came from physical labor. His face was handsome in a rugged way, but marked by a sadness that seemed to go deeper than temporary grief. When he removed his hat to shake hands with Webb, Isabella saw that his dark hair was indeed streaked with premature gray, and his brown eyes held a weariness that spoke of recent loss. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to control his emotions through discipline. "And will, name's Jacob Steele," he said to Webb, pulling a leather pouch from his vest pocket. "I'll pay in gold, if that's acceptable." As Jacob counted out the coins, Isabella noticed his hands. They were calloused and scarred from work, but they moved with a gentleness that contradicted their obvious strength. When he spoke to Webb, his voice was polite but distant, as if he were conducting a business transaction he found distasteful. But necessary. The exchange took only a few minutes. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and Isabella found herself legally transferred from one owner to another like a piece of livestock. Jacob accepted the documentation with no more emotion than he might show when purchasing supplies, then turned to look at her directly for the first time. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised her. "If you're ready, we should be going." Isabella looked around the market square one last time, seeing the faces of people she had known all her life watching her departure with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction. Her father was nowhere to be seen, probably deliberately, as Cordelia had likely arranged for him to be absent during the actual sale. Her stepmother stood near the edge of the crowd, her face showing none of the triumph Isabella had expected. Only a cold satisfaction at having solved the problem. "I'm ready," Isabella said quietly. Though she had no idea what she was ready for, Jacob nodded and gestured toward a wagon that waited at the edge of the square. It was a simple but well-maintained vehicle, drawn by two horses that looked strong and healthy. In the back, Isabella could see supplies and equipment that suggested a long journey ahead. As they walked toward the wagon, Isabella realized that this might be her last chance to speak as a free person, even though her freedom had been largely illusory for months. "Mr. Steele," she said hesitantly, "may I ask where we're going?" Jacob helped her up onto the wagon seat with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout the transaction. "My ranch," he replied simply. "About 3 days' ride north of here. You'll be safe there." It wasn't much information, but something in his tone suggested that safety was not a guarantee she should take lightly. As Jacob climbed up beside her and took the reins, Isabella took one last look at Copper Ridge, the town where she had been born, raised, married, and ultimately sold. She was 22 years old, owned by a stranger, and heading into a future she couldn't imagine. But for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Whatever Jacob Steele intended for her, whatever life awaited her at his ranch, it had to be better than the systematic destruction of her spirit that Cordelia had orchestrated. As the wagon rolled out of town, leaving behind the only life Isabella had ever known, she found herself wondering about the man sitting beside her. Why had he paid so much for a woman everyone else considered damaged goods? What did he want from her? And most importantly, what had she seen in his eyes that made her think that maybe, just maybe, this transaction might be the beginning of something better, rather than the end of everything good? The desert stretched ahead of them, vast and unknown, but Isabella faced it with something she hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the dusty trail as they left Copper Ridge behind, each turn of the spokes carrying Isabella further from the only world she had ever known. The morning sun climbed steadily overhead, transforming the desert landscape into a shimmering expanse of heat and possibility. Beside her, Jacob Steele maintained a silence that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply present, like the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves or the whisper of wind through the scrub brush. For the first hour of their journey, Isabella found herself stealing glances at the man who had purchased her future. His profile was strong and weathered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the desert sun. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, calloused from work but gentle with the horses. Everything about him suggested competence and reliability, qualities that should have been reassuring but somehow made Isabella more nervous about what he expected from her. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled north, the familiar red rocks and sparse vegetation of Copper Ridge, giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper trees and patches of grassland that hinted at better grazing ahead. It was beautiful country, wild and untamed in a way that made Isabella feel both insignificant and strangely liberated. For months, her world had been confined to the suffocating atmosphere of her stepmother's house. Now she was surrounded by endless sky and boundless horizons. "Mr. Steele," Isabella finally ventured, her voice sounding small in the vastness around them, "may I ask about your ranch? What kind of work will be expected of me?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Isabella wondered if he had heard her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the words were difficult for him. "It's a cattle operation," he said simply. "About 2,000 head, good water, decent grazing. The house is comfortable enough, though it's not fancy like what you're probably used to." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal before continuing. "There are 3 children. My wife passed 6 months ago, and they've been struggling without a woman's care. I hired housekeepers, But none of them lasted more than a few weeks. The children are difficult, and the isolation is hard on most women. Isabella felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Caring for children was far from the worst fate she had imagined, but she had no experience with youngsters and no idea what difficult might mean in this context. "How old are the children?" she asked. "Emma's 12, Thomas is 9, and little Sarah is 6, Jacob replied, his voice softening slightly when he mentioned their names. "They're good kids, just angry and hurt. They blame me for their mother's death, and they don't trust easily anymore." The pieces of Jacob's story were beginning to form a picture that explained his presence at the auction. He wasn't a man seeking a wife or companion for his own needs. He was a desperate father trying to provide care for his grieving children. The realization should have been comforting, but it also added pressure. Isabella knew nothing about raising children. And these weren't ordinary children, but ones dealing with profound loss. "What happened to your wife?" Isabella asked gently, then immediately worried she had overstepped. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Cholera," Jacob said quietly. "Swept through the valley last spring. Took Mary and about a dozen others before. It burned itself out. She was helping care for the sick, wouldn't stay home safe when people needed her. That was Mary, always putting others first." The grief in his voice was raw and immediate, making it clear that 6 months had done little to heal the wound of his loss. Isabella found herself feeling something unexpected: sympathy for this stranger who had bought her freedom from one form of bondage but might be offering her a different kind of purpose. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "It must be incredibly difficult, managing everything alone." Jacob nodded but didn't respond immediately. They rode in silence for another mile before he spoke again, and when he did, his words surprised her. "I want to be clear about something," he said, his voice taking on a formal tone. "What happened back there, the transaction, I know what it looked like, what people assumed. But you're not property to me. You're a person in a difficult situation, and I'm a man who needs help with his children. If we can help each other, that's good. If not, I'll take you wherever you want to go and give you enough money to start over." Isabella stared at him in astonishment. In all her imagining about what this journey might bring, she had never considered the possibility that her buyer might offer her freedom as an option. "You would do that?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I've got enough guilt on my conscience." Without adding the weight of keeping someone against their will, Jacob replied grimly, "My children need care, and you need a place to belong. If we can't make that work naturally, forcing it won't help anyone." The conversation lapsed again, but the silence felt different, now less tense, more contemplative. Isabella found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not as a path to imprisonment, but as a route to possibility. The idea that she might have choices in her future, even limited ones, was intoxicating after months of complete powerlessness. As the morning wore on, Jacob began pointing out landmarks and sharing information about the country they were traveling through. He showed her the distant mountains that marked the boundaries of his ranch, explained the seasonal patterns of rainfall and drought that determined the success or failure of cattle operations, and identified the various plants and animals that called this harsh but beautiful land home. "That's Eagle Country up there," he said, gesturing toward a series of high cliffs. Mary used to love watching them hunt. Said they reminded her that freedom was possible, even in the hardest places. Isabella caught the wistful tone in his voice and realized that this journey was difficult for him too. He was traveling familiar roads that held memories of happier times, probably retracing routes he had taken with his wife. Every landmark probably carried associations with the woman he had lost. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Isabella said carefully. "She was," Jacob agreed simply. "Tougher than most men I know, but gentle with anyone who needed kindness. The children adored her, and she had a way of making even the hardest days seem manageable." The implicit comparison wasn't lost on Isabella. She was being brought in to fill the role of an extraordinary woman, to care for children who had lost someone irreplaceable. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, and Jacob called a halt near a small stream that wound its way through a grove of cottonwood trees. The shade was welcome, and the sound of running water provided a peaceful backdrop as they rested the horses and ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat that Jacob had packed for the journey. Isabella had traveled very little in her life, and never under circumstances like these. The combination of uncertainty about her future and the strange intimacy of sharing a meal with a virtual stranger in the middle of nowhere created a surreal atmosphere that made everything feel dreamlike. "Can I ask you something?" Jacob said, as they prepared to resume their journey. Isabella nodded, though she felt a flutter of nervousness about what he might want to know. "The auction," he said carefully. "Your stepmother said you were barren. Is that true?" The question was so direct and personal that Isabella felt her cheeks burn. But there was no judgment in Jacob's voice, only the practical tone of someone seeking information he needed to make decisions. "Yes," she said quietly. 4 years of marriage, every treatment the doctors could suggest, every folk remedy anyone recommended. Nothing worked. Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sorry. That must have been painful." "It was," Isabella admitted. "But apparently it makes me more suitable for certain arrangements." "Maybe," Jacob said, standing and brushing dust from his pants. "Or maybe it just means you'll have more time and energy to focus on children who need you. Depends on how you look at it." The simple shift in perspective was so unexpected that Isabella found herself blinking back tears. For years, her inability to conceive had been framed as a failure, a fundamental inadequacy that made her useless as a woman. The idea that it might instead be a qualification for a different kind of important work was revolutionary. The afternoon portion of their journey took them through increasingly varied terrain. They climbed through pine forests where the air was cool and sweet with the scent of resin, descended into valleys where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and crossed several streams that ran clear and cold from mountain springs. Beauty of the country was breathtaking, but Isabella found herself watching Jacob as much as the scenery. He was a complicated man, she was beginning to realize. His grief was evident in every line of his face, but so was his determination to care for his children. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and kind. He had paid a significant sum for her at auction, but he offered her freedom and treated her with respect. Everything about him contradicted her expectations about the kind of man who would purchase a woman in a public market. "Mr. Steele," she said as they navigated a particularly rocky stretch of trail, "may I ask why you chose to acquire help this way? Surely there were other options for finding someone to care for your children." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on guiding the horses through the difficult footing. When he finally answered, his voice carried a vulnerability that surprised her. "I tried the conventional approaches," he said. "Placed advertisements in newspapers, contacted agencies that supply domestic help, even asked around at churches in nearby towns. But when people heard about the isolation, the difficult children, the recent tragedy, most weren't interested. The few who came didn't last." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "Then I heard about your situation. A woman who had experience managing a household, who was educated and refined, but who was in circumstances desperate enough that she might be willing to consider a difficult position. It seemed like we might be able to help each other." "You heard about me specifically?" Isabella asked, surprised. "Word travels in this territory," Jacob explained. The story of William Crenshaw's daughter and her marriage troubles was common knowledge. "When I learned that your stepmother was looking to ... Make arrangements. I thought it might be an opportunity for all of us. Isabella processed this information with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was somewhat reassuring to know that Jacob's decision had been based on practical considerations rather than darker motivations. On the other hand, the idea that her personal tragedy had been the subject of territorial gossip was humiliating. I see, she said quietly. I know it's not an ideal situation, Jacob continued. Being bought and sold like livestock, having your private business become public knowledge, starting over with complete strangers. But sometimes life doesn't offer us ideal choices. Sometimes we have to make the best of difficult circumstances. The wisdom in his words resonated with Isabella's own recent experiences. Her marriage, her stepmother's cruelty, the auction, none of it had been chosen or welcomed. But perhaps Jacob was right that survival sometimes meant finding ways to transform necessity into opportunity. As the day wore on, Isabella found herself sharing more of her own story. She told Jacob about her marriage, her attempts to conceive, the gradual breakdown of her relationship with Jonathan and his family. She described Cordelia's systematic campaign of humiliation and the financial pressures that had led to the auction. She even admitted her fears about caring for children she had never met, who were dealing with grief she couldn't fully understand. Jacob listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never offering judgment or false reassurance. His quiet attention was itself a form of kindness that Isabella hadn't experienced in months. The children won't make it easy, he warned as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Emma's angry and resentful. She thinks no one can replace her mother, and she's probably right. Thomas is quieter, but he blames himself for Mary's death because he was sick first, and she caught the cholera caring for him. And Sarah. Sarah barely speaks anymore. She used to be the most talkative child you ever met, always singing and laughing. Now she just watches everything with those big eyes and says maybe a dozen words a day. The picture Jacob painted was heartbreaking, and Isabella felt a surge of sympathy for these children she hadn't yet met. How do you manage? She asked. Badly, Jacob admitted with brutal honesty. I keep them fed and clothed and safe, but that's about it. I don't know how to help them heal, and I'm so buried in my own grief that half the time I can barely function. It's not fair to them, but I don't know what else to do. The raw honesty of his admission moved Isabella deeply. Here was a man who had lost his wife, was struggling to raise 3 traumatized children, and was managing a demanding ranch operation. Yet he was humble enough to admit his limitations and seek help. Maybe we can figure it out together, she said impulsively, then worried that she had presumed too much. But Jacob turned to look at her, with something that might have been hope flickering in his dark eyes. Maybe we can, he agreed quietly. As evening approached, they crested a hill that offered their first view of Jacob's ranch. The sight that spread before them took Isabella's breath away. A broad valley stretched between protective hills, crossed by a meandering river that caught the last light of the setting sun. Cattle dotted the grassland in peaceful groups, and several horses grazed in a fenced pasture near a cluster of buildings that marked the ranch headquarters. The house itself was larger than Isabella had expected, a 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and multiple chimneys that suggested comfortable living spaces within. Outbuildings included a large barn, several smaller structures that were probably for equipment and feed storage, and what looked like quarters for ranch hands. It's beautiful, Isabella breathed, and she meant it. The ranch had a sense of permanence and prosperity that spoke well of Jacob's management abilities. Mary designed most of it, Jacob said quietly. She had strong opinions about how a place should look and feel. Said her ranch wasn't just a business, it was a home, and home should be beautiful as well as functional. As they descended toward the ranch buildings, Isabella caught sight of 3 small figures watching from the front porch. Even at a distance, their body language spoke of suspicion and reluctance. These were the children whose care she was being brought to assume. 3 young people who had lost the most important person in their world and were now faced with a stranger who was supposed to somehow fill that void. The weight of responsibility settled more heavily on Isabella's shoulders as the wagon rolled into the ranch yard. Dogs barked in greeting, chickens scattered from their path, and the sound of their arrival brought several ranch hands from the barn to help with the horses and supplies. But Isabella's attention was fixed on the 3 children who stood watching from the porch, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and carefully guarded hope. In a few minutes, she would meet them, speak with them, and begin the process of trying to build relationships that could help heal their broken family. She had no experience with children, no training in dealing with grief, and no idea whether she possessed the qualities necessary to provide what these young people needed. But as Jacob brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house, and the children began to move cautiously down the steps to greet them, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever difficulties she would face in trying to build a new life in this remote and beautiful place, she was no longer powerless. She had been given an opportunity to matter again, to contribute something valuable to people who needed what she might be able to offer. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings. As Jacob helped her down from the wagon and turned to introduce her to his children, Isabella took a deep breath and prepared to discover what kind of future they might be able to create together. The girl who stepped forward first was clearly Emma. The 12-year-old who Jacob had warned was angry and resentful. She was tall for her age, with dark hair braided severely back and eyes that held a challenging intensity. Her dress was clean but plain, and everything about her posture suggested a young person who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "So you're the replacement," Emma said, her voice carrying a hostility that made Isabella's stomach tighten. "Emma," Jacob said sharply, but Isabella held up a hand to stop him. "I'm Isabella," she said calmly, meeting the girl's hostile gaze directly. "And I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm here to help, if you'll let me." The battle lines were drawn, the initial challenges were clear, and Isabella's new life was about to begin in earnest. Whatever came next would test every reserve of strength, patience, and wisdom she possessed. But for the first time since her world had collapsed, she was ready to fight for something worth having. Emma's challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Isabella realized that her first moments at the steel ranch would set the tone for everything that followed. The 12-year-old stood with her arms crossed, her chin raised in defiance, clearly expecting Isabella to either crumble under the hostility or respond with the kind of harsh authority that would justify her resentment. Instead, Isabella did something unexpected. She smiled. "You know what, Emma?" Isabella said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to surprise the girl. "I think you and I are going to understand each other just fine. I've spent the last few months being told I was a replacement for someone better, and I hated every minute of it. So I promise you this, I'm not here to be your new mother. I'm here to be myself, and maybe that will be enough to help." Emma's hostile expression flickered with confusion. She had clearly prepared for battle, but Isabella's response had disarmed her primary weapon. The girl opened her mouth to deliver another cutting remark, then seemed to think better of it. Behind Emma, a boy who could only be Thomas stepped forward hesitantly. He was smaller than his sister, with the same dark hair but gentler eyes that held a wariness born of pain rather than anger. His clothes were clean, but bore the telltale signs of a child who spent his days outdoors, grass stains, small tears that had been carefully mended, and the general rumpled appearance of someone who moved through the world with distracted energy. "Are you really going to stay?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. The other ladies always left. The question was so simple, so vulnerable, that Isabella felt her heart constrict. This little boy had already watched strangers come and go, each departure probably reinforcing his belief that the people he needed would eventually abandon him. "I'm going to try my best to stay," Isabella said honestly. "But that depends on a lot of things, including whether you and your brother and sister want me here." "We don't," Emma said quickly, but her protest lacked the venom of her earlier words. "That's okay," Isabella replied calmly. "I don't expect you to want me here. I'm a stranger, and you've already lost the most important person in your world. But wanting me here and letting me help aren't the same thing. Maybe we can start with the second one and see what happens." The third child, little Sarah, remained partially hidden behind her older siblings. Isabella caught glimpses of her, a small face with huge eyes, pale hair that needed brushing, and a dress that was too big for her tiny frame. The 6-year-old watched everything with the intensity of someone much older, but she said nothing. Jacob had been standing quietly during this exchange, but now he stepped forward to take charge of the practical matters. "Let's get you settled," he said to Isabella. "Emma, take Miss Isabella's bag up to the guest room. Thomas, help me with the supplies. Sarah." He paused, looking at his youngest daughter with an expression of helpless love. "Sarah, you can come help if you want to." The evening routine that followed gave Isabella her first real glimpse into the daily life of the Steele family. The house was indeed comfortable, furnished with a mixture of practical frontier furniture and more refined pieces that spoke of Mary Steele's influence. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a massive wood stove that had clearly been the heart of family life. The dining room held a table that could seat 8, though it was clear that only 4 chairs had been used regularly in recent months. Emma performed her assigned task with grudging efficiency, leading Isabella up a staircase that creaked pleasantly under their feet. The guest room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard toward the mountains beyond. It was sparse but comfortable, and Isabella felt a surge of gratitude that she would have a private space to retreat to when the challenges of her new life became overwhelming. "This was supposed to be a sewing room," Emma said as she set Isabella's bag on the bed. "Mama was going to teach me to make my own dresses when I got older. But I guess that's not happening now." The statement was delivered with studied casualness, but Isabella heard the pain underneath. Emma was old enough to understand that her mother's death had stolen not just her past, but her future, all the plans, dreams, and shared experiences. That would never happen. "I know how to sew," Isabella said carefully. "If you ever want to learn, I'd be happy to teach you. But only if you want to." Emma studied her suspiciously. "Are you trying to bribe me?" "No," Isabella said with a laugh. "I'm trying to be useful. There's a difference." Downstairs, the evening meal was a quiet affair that revealed the family's current dynamics with painful clarity. Jacob sat at the head of the table, his attention focused on his food with the mechanical concentration of someone who ate for fuel rather than pleasure. Emma picked at her meal while maintaining a running commentary of subtle criticism about everything from the temperature of the food to the way the table was set. Thomas ate steadily but nervously, as if afraid that any sound might draw unwanted attention. And Sarah sat completely silent, consuming tiny bites with the precision of someone who had learned that drawing attention to herself was dangerous. Isabella found herself studying the children more than eating, trying to understand the family dynamics that had developed in the months since Mary's death. Emma had clearly assumed the role of family critic, using anger to mask her grief and establishing her authority through constant judgment. Thomas seemed to have retreated into himself, seeking invisibility as a form of protection. And Sarah had apparently decided that silence was the safest response to a world that had become unpredictable and painful. "The biscuits are burned," Emma announced, examining her plate with exaggerated disappointment. "I made them," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying a note of weary defensiveness. "I know," Emma replied, her tone suggesting that this explained everything. Isabella looked at the biscuits, which were indeed slightly overdone but perfectly edible. She could see that this was a familiar pattern: Emma criticizing, Jacob accepting the criticism with guilty resignation, and the younger children learning that home was a place where nothing was quite good enough. "They taste fine to me," Isabella sighed, taking a deliberate bite. "Maybe a little crispy, but I like them that way. My stepmother's cook used to burn everything completely black. These are practically perfect by comparison." Emma looked surprised by this response. She had clearly expected Isabella to either agree with her criticism or defend Jacob's efforts. Instead, Isabella had offered a different perspective that reframed the situation entirely. "Your stepmother had a cook?" Thomas asked, looking up from his plate with genuine curiosity. "She did," Isabella confirmed. "A woman named Mrs. Hendricks who couldn't have made a decent meal if her life depended on it. She once burned water, literally boiled a pot dry, and scorched the bottom so badly we had to throw it away." This earned a small smile from Thomas, and even a slight softening in Emma's expression. Sarah remained silent, but Isabella noticed that the little girl was listening intently. "Why didn't she fire her?" Emma asked, her natural curiosity overcoming her determination to remain hostile. "Because Mrs. Hendricks was willing to work for practically nothing," Isabella explained. "My stepmother was more interested in saving money than eating well. She used to say that food was just fuel, and it didn't matter what it tasted like as long as it kept us from starving." "That's stupid," Thomas said emphatically, then looked worried that he had spoken too boldly. "It really is," Isabella agreed. "Good food is one of life's pleasures. It brings families together, makes celebrations special, and turns ordinary days into something worth remembering. Your father's biscuits might not be perfect, but they're made with love, and that counts for a lot." Jacob looked up from his plate with an expression of gratitude that made Isabella's chest tighten. It was clear that he had been carrying the weight of domestic failures along with everything else, and her simple reframing of the situation had offered him a moment of relief. After dinner, Isabella insisted on helping with the dishes, despite Emma's protests that she didn't know where anything belonged. The kitchen cleanup became an opportunity for Isabella to observe the family's routines and begin inserting herself into their daily life. She washed while Emma dried, noting how the girl's movements were efficient but joyless, as if she were performing a duty rather than participating in a shared activity. "Mama used to sing while she did the dishes," Thomas said unexpectedly, appearing in the kitchen doorway with a handful of glasses that had been left on the table. "What kind of songs?" Isabella asked, accepting the glasses and adding them to the wash water. "Happy ones," Thomas replied. "Songs about flowers and sunshine and places where it rains all the time." She said washing dishes was boring, so she made up stories to go with the songs. "That sounds wonderful," Isabella said sincerely. "I'm not much of a singer, but I know some stories. Maybe I could tell you one while we work." Emma looked skeptical, but she didn't object when Isabella began recounting a tale about a clever princess who outwitted a dragon not through force but through kindness and intelligence. The story was one Isabella had heard as a child, but she found herself adapting it as she spoke, making the princess more independent and resourceful than the traditional version. By the time the dishes were finished, all three children were listening intently, and even Sarah had crept closer to hear the story's conclusion. Isabella had managed to transform a mundane chore into something approaching entertainment, and she could see that the children were beginning to view her with cautious interest rather than outright hostility. The bedtime routine revealed new challenges and opportunities. Emma declared that she was old enough to put herself to bed and didn't need help from anyone. Isabella respected this assertion of independence, simply wishing the girl good night and letting her retreat to her room with her dignity intact. Thomas was more amenable to assistance, allowing Isabella to help him find his nightclothes and brush his teeth. though he maintained a careful distance that suggested he wasn't ready to fully trust her. Yet Sarah was the most heartbreaking. Little girl stood in her bedroom doorway, clutching a worn doll and looking lost in a space that seemed too big for her. Isabella knelt down to Sarah's eye level, speaking softly and moving slowly to avoid startling her. "Would you like me to help you get ready for bed?" Isabella asked gently. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, and Isabella felt a small surge of triumph. The next few minutes were spent in quiet activity, helping Sarah into her nightgown, brushing her pale hair with gentle strokes, and tucking her into a bed that seemed enormous for such a small child. "Mama used to tell me stories," Sarah whispered. Her first words of the evening. "What kind of stories did she tell?" Isabella asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. "About brave little girls who weren't scared of anything," Sarah replied, her voice so quiet that Isabella had to lean forward to hear her. "Would you like me to tell you a story like that?" Isabella offered. Sarah nodded, and Isabella began improvising. A tale about a little girl who lived on a ranch and had adventures with magical horses. The story was simple and soothing, designed more to comfort than to excite, and by the time Isabella finished, Sarah's eyes were heavy with sleep. "Will you tell me another story tomorrow?" Sarah asked as Isabella prepared to leave. "If you'd like me to," Isabella replied, and she meant it. The request was such a small thing, but it represented the first genuine connection she had made with one of the children. Downstairs, Isabella found Jacob sitting on the front porch, smoking a pipe and staring out at the dark landscape. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of sage and pine, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of cattle moving restlessly in the night. "How did it go?" Jacob asked as Isabella settled into the chair beside him. "Better than I expected, not as well as I hoped," Isabella replied honestly. "Emma's going to be a challenge, but I think I understand what she's trying to do. Thomas wants to trust me, but doesn't dare. And Sarah ... Isabella paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah's protecting herself by disappearing. She's there, but she's not really there." Jacob nodded grimly. "That's about what I expected. Emma's been angry since the day Mary died, but especially since the funeral. She thinks I should have been able to save her mother somehow, and she's probably right. Thomas blames himself because he was sick first, and nothing I say seems to convince him otherwise. And Sarah ... Sarah hasn't been the same since she watched her mother die. She used to be fearless, always laughing and getting into mischief. Now she acts like she's afraid of her own shadow." "They're all grieving," Isabella said gently. "But they're grieving in different ways, and they're all trying to protect themselves from being hurt again. That's going to take time to heal." "Time we might not have," Jacob said quietly. "The ranch is struggling without Mary's help with the books and the household management. I'm behind on correspondence, the house is barely functional, and the children are getting wilder every day. I was hoping that bringing you here might solve some of those problems, but I'm starting to wonder if I've just added another complication to an already impossible situation." Isabella understood his concern, but she also heard the exhaustion in his voice. Jacob was a man who had been carrying too much for too long, and his reserves were running dangerously low. "What if we approach this differently?" Isabella suggested. "Instead of trying to solve everything at once, what if we focus on one thing at a time? Give me a few days to get settled and figure out what the children need most. Then we can work on the household management, the ranch business, and all the other pieces. You think that will work?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying a note of hope. That made Isabella's chest tighten. "I think it's worth trying," Isabella replied. "We're both dealing with situations we never expected to face. But maybe together we can find solutions that neither of us could manage alone." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than doubtful. Mary used to say that the best solutions were usually the simplest ones, he said. Maybe you're right. Maybe we've been trying to fix everything at once instead of just focusing on what's most important. What do you think is most important? Isabella asked. The children, Jacob replied without hesitation. Everything else is just details. If we can help them heal, if we can give them a stable home and a sense of security, the rest will follow. Isabella nodded, feeling a sense of shared purpose that she hadn't experienced in months. Then that's where we start. The next few days established a pattern that slowly began to transform the household dynamics. Isabella woke early to help with breakfast, not because she was assigned the task, but because she wanted to contribute. She discovered that Jacob was actually a decent cook when he wasn't exhausted and distracted, and together they began producing meals that were both nutritious and appealing. Emma initially resisted Isabella's involvement in the kitchen, claiming that she had been managing things perfectly well on her own. But Isabella's approach was collaborative rather than controlling, asking for Emma's opinions and deferring to her knowledge of family preferences. Gradually, the girl began to relax her guard, and Isabella started to see glimpses of the intelligent, capable young woman Emma was becoming. Thomas was easier to reach than his sister, but his trust came in small increments. Isabella discovered that he loved stories about adventure and heroism, and she began tailoring her evening tailies to include brave boys who overcame obstacles through courage and determination. She also learned that Thomas felt responsible for many of the family's problems, and she worked to gently challenge those feelings of guilt without dismissing his pain. Sarah remained the most challenging of the three children, but Isabella found ways to connect with her through small, quiet moments. She taught Sarah to braid flowers into chains, helped her tend a small garden plot behind the house, and continued the bedtime stories that seemed to be the little girl's favorite part of each day. The real test came on the fourth day, when a sudden thunderstorm struck the ranch with terrifying intensity. The wind howled around the house, rattling windows and sending loose objects flying across the yard. Rain pounded against the roof with such force that conversation became impossible, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark frightening flashes. Isabella found Emma in the kitchen, standing at the window and trying to project calm despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Thomas was huddled at the table, his face pale with anxiety, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Sarah?" Isabella asked, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. "She ran upstairs when the thunder started," Emma replied, her voice tight with worry. "She does that now. Any loud noise sends her running." Isabella found Sarah in her bedroom, wedged into the narrow space between her bed and the wall, clutching her doll and shaking with terror. The little girl's eyes were wide and unfocused, and she seemed to be reliving some terrible memory rather than simply responding to the current storm. "Sarah, sweetie, it's okay," Isabella said softly, kneeling beside the bed. "It's just a storm. You're safe in the house." But Sarah didn't respond to her voice or her presence. She continued to shake and whimper, lost in whatever traumatic memory the thunder had triggered. Isabella made a decision that would later prove to be a turning point in her relationship with all three children. Instead of trying to coax Sarah out of her hiding place or attempting to calm her with words, Isabella simply crawled into the small space beside her and held her close. "It's okay to be scared," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Storms are scary, and it's okay to need comfort when you're frightened. But you don't have to be scared alone." For several minutes, they remained huddled together while the storm raged outside. Isabella didn't try to convince Sarah that her fear was irrational or unnecessary. Instead, she simply provided a warm, safe presence that gradually helped the little girl return to the present moment. When the storm finally began to subside, Isabella helped Sarah out of her hiding place and led her downstairs to the kitchen, where Emma and Thomas were waiting anxiously. The older children's relief at seeing their sister safe was palpable, and Isabella realized that they had been carrying their own fears about Sarah's emotional state. "Is she okay?" Thomas asked, his voice small and worried. "She's okay, Isabella," confirmed, settling Sarah at the table and wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. "She was just scared by the storm, and that's perfectly normal. We all get scared sometimes." Emma looked at Isabella with something approaching respect. "The other ladies didn't know what to do when Sarah got like that," she said quietly. "They just stood there and told her to stop being silly." "Fear isn't silly," Isabella replied firmly. "It's real, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be present with someone who's scared, so they know they're not alone." That night, as Isabella helped put the children to bed, she sensed a shift in their attitudes toward her. Emma was less hostile. Thomas was more trusting, and Sarah actually asked her to stay a few extra minutes after the bedtime story ended. "Miss Isabella?" Sarah said as Isabella prepared to leave the room. "Yes, sweetie? Are you going to stay tomorrow?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the same vulnerability that had marked Thomas's earlier question. "I'm going to stay tomorrow," Isabella promised. "And the day after that, and the day after that. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah." "Promise?" Sarah whispered. "I promise," Isabella replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Later, as Isabella sat on the porch with Jacob, he asked about the day's events. She told him about the storm, about Sarah's fear, and about the small but significant progress she felt she was making with all 3 children. "You handled that better than I would have," Jacob admitted. "I probably would have tried to talk her out of being scared, or gotten frustrated when she wouldn't listen to reason." "Fear doesn't respond to reason," Isabella said softly. "It responds to comfort and safety, and the knowledge that someone cares enough to stay with you through the scary parts." Jacob looked at her with an expression that held both gratitude and something deeper, a recognition that Isabella understood his children in ways that he was still learning. "Murray would have liked you," he said quietly. "She would have appreciated the way you see the children as individuals rather than just problems to be solved." The compliment meant more to Isabella than Jacob could have known. After months of being told she was inadequate, useless, and fundamentally flawed, being recognized for her insight and compassion felt like a gift. As the week progressed, Isabella began to establish her place in the family structure. She wasn't trying to replace Mary. That would have been impossible and inappropriate. Instead, she was becoming something new, a bridge between the children's grief and their future, a source of stability in a world that had been shaken by loss, and a reminder that it was possible to care for people without trying to control or change them. The children were beginning to trust her. Jacob was starting to rely on her, and Isabella was discovering that she had strengths she had never recognized. She might not be able to bear children, but she was learning that there were many ways to nurture and protect the young people who needed her care. The battle for belonging was far from over, but Isabella had won the first crucial victories. She had proven that she could be trusted with the children's fears, that she could provide comfort without judgment, and that she was committed to staying even when things got difficult. As she settled into her narrow bed that night, listening to the peaceful sounds of a household at rest, Isabella realized that for the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 weeks into Isabella's new life at the Steel Ranch, the fragile peace she had carefully built with the children was about to face its greatest test. The morning started like any other, with breakfast preparations and the comfortable routine they had established. But everything changed when a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, announcing visitors to their remote valley. Jacob emerged from the barn where he had been checking on a mare about to foal, his expression growing tense as he recognized the approaching riders. Isabella watched from the kitchen window as 3 men on horseback drew closer, their expensive clothes and well-groomed mounts marking them as visitors from town rather than neighboring ranchers. "Emma, take Thomas and Sarah inside," Jacob called, his voice carrying an authority that made all three children respond immediately. "Stay there until I tell you otherwise." Isabella felt her stomach drop as she recognized the lead rider. Jonathan Westbrook, her former husband, sat tall in his saddle with the same arrogant bearing that had once made her feel small and inadequate. Beside him rode a man she didn't recognize, while the third rider was unmistakably Sheriff Coleman. From Copper Ridge, the confrontation that followed would determine not just Isabella's future, but the stability of the new family that had begun to form around the shared need for healing and belonging. Jonathan dismounted with theatrical precision, smoothing his vest and adjusting his hat before approaching the porch where Jacob waited. Isabella remained inside, watching through the partially open door while the children clustered behind her, their faces reflecting confusion and growing alarm. "Mr. Steele," Jonathan said with false courtesy, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jacob's stance remained relaxed, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders. "I don't believe we've met, Mr. Westbrook, Jonathan Westbrook, and I've come for my wife." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had known this moment might come, but she had allowed herself to hope that her former life would remain buried in Copper Ridge. Now Jonathan stood in the ranch yard, claiming ownership of her as if the auction had never happened. "Your wife?" Jacob repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "I understood Miss Crenshaw was unmarried." "A temporary misunderstanding," Jonathan replied smoothly. "Isabella suffered from feminine hysteria after our brief separation. Her stepmother acted hastily in arranging that unfortunate business in town. But I've come to collect her and restore her to her proper place." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, producing a folded document from his coat. "I have papers here stating that the marriage between Jonathan Westbrook and Isabella Crenshaw was never legally dissolved. The auction sale is therefore invalid, as a man cannot sell another man's wife." Isabella's hands began to shake as the implications became clear. Jonathan had somehow manipulated the legal system to retroactively claim that their marriage was still valid, making her sale to Jacob illegal and her current situation fraudulent. "That's interesting," Jacob said calmly, though Isabella could hear the steel underlying his quiet tone. "May I examine those papers?" As Jacob reviewed the documents, Isabella found herself remembering every cruelty Jonathan had inflicted during their marriage, every moment of humiliation and rejection. The idea of returning to that life, of being dragged back to a man who had discarded her when she proved unable to bear children, was more terrifying than any physical danger she could imagine. Behind her, Emma whispered urgently, "Who are those men? Why are they here?" Isabella turned to face the three children, seeing her own fear reflected in their faces. Thomas looked pale and worried, while Sarah had pressed herself against Isabella's skirt, seeking the comfort and protection that had become their routine during moments of stress. "They're people from my old life," Isabella said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "They think I should go back with them, but you can't." Thomas burst out, his usual quietness forgotten in his distress. "You promised Sarah you would stay." Emma's face had gone white with something beyond fear. "You're leaving us too?" she asked, her voice cracking with the weight of another abandonment. "Everyone always leaves." Before Isabella could respond, Jacob's voice carried clearly from the porch. "These papers appear to be in order, Sheriff, but they don't tell the whole story. Miss Crenshaw came here of her own free will, after being legally sold by her guardian. If Mr. Westbrook wants to claim her, he'll need to reimburse me for my investment." Jonathan's laugh was harsh and contemptuous. "Investment? You mean the money you paid for damaged goods? Consider it a lesson learned, Steele. You can't turn a barren woman into something valuable just by changing her location." The insult struck Isabella with familiar pain, But this time she felt something else alongside the hurt: rage. Not just at Jonathan's cruelty, but at the entire system that treated women as property to be traded between men without regard for their wishes or well-being. "Papa?" Sarah's small voice cut through Isabella's internal turmoil. The little girl was looking up at Jacob with confusion and fear. "Is Miss Isabella really going away?" Jacob's expression softened as he looked at his youngest daughter, but his voice remained firm. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Jonathan growing increasingly impatient and the sheriff looking uncomfortable with the entire situation. Isabella realized that she could remain passive no longer. This was her life being decided by men who saw her as property, and she had already sacrificed too much of herself to such arrangements. Taking a deep breath, Isabella stepped out onto the porch, facing Jonathan directly for the first time since their marriage had ended. The sight of him brought back a flood of painful memories, but also a clarity about how much she had changed during her time at the ranch. "Hello, Jonathan," she said calmly, her voice carrying none of the deference he was accustomed to hearing from her. "Isabella," he replied, his tone suggesting he was addressing a wayward child rather than his supposed wife. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. Collect your things and come home. I've prepared to overlook your unfortunate behavior if you return quietly and resume your proper duties." "And what duties would those be?" Isabella asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "The same ones I failed at so spectacularly that you declared our marriage a mistake and had me removed from your house." Jonathan's face reddened at this public reminder of his previous rejection. "You were ill, Isabella, overwrought by your condition. But I'm prepared to be forgiving if you show proper gratitude for my generosity." "Generous," Isabella repeated, tasting the word as if it were something bitter. "Yes, I can see how dragging me back to a marriage you already ended would be considered generous. Tell me, Jonathan, what changed your mind? Did your new wife prove as disappointing as I was?" The hit struck home. Jonathan's companion, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, and Isabella realized that her guess had been accurate. Jonathan's grand gesture of reclaiming his wife was probably motivated by the failure of his subsequent marriage, rather than any genuine desire for reconciliation. "My personal affairs are not your concern," Jonathan snapped. "You are my wife, and you will return with me. Sheriff Coleman has the authority to enforce these legal documents." Sheriff Coleman looked increasingly unhappy with his role in the proceedings. "Ma'am," he said to Isabella, his voice gentler than his official capacity required, "these papers do seem to indicate that you're legally married to Mr. Westbrook. I don't have much choice but to enforce them." Isabella felt the moment crystallizing around her. She could submit to Jonathan's claim, return to a life that had nearly destroyed her spirit, and abandon the children who had begun to trust her. Or she could fight for the new life she had built, even though the legal system seemed stacked against her. "Sheriff Coleman," she said formally, "before you enforce those documents, I'd like to point out something interesting about them. Jonathan claims our marriage was never dissolved, but he's forgetting that he publicly annulled it on grounds of my failure to fulfill my wifely duties. He had me removed from his house, declared me unfit to be his wife, and married another woman. Those actions constitute abandonment and invalidate any claim he might have to ongoing marriage rights." Jonathan's face went pale as he realized that Isabella was no longer the meek, compliant woman he had once controlled. "You can't prove any of that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can," Isabella replied calmly. "Jacob, would you please bring out the territorial newspaper from last spring, the one with the social announcements?" Jacob disappeared into the house and returned with a folded newspaper, which he handed to the sheriff. Isabella had remembered seeing the announcement of Jonathan's second marriage, complete with details about his previous union being dissolved due to irreconcilable differences. Sheriff Coleman examined the newspaper with growing interest. This seems to contradict your legal documents. Mr. Westbrook, according to this announcement, you were a widower seeking a new wife after your previous marriage ended due to, it says here, fundamental incompatibilities that prevented the fulfillment of marital obligations. Jonathan sputtered protests, but the damage was done. His legal strategy had been built on the assumption that no one would challenge his version of events or produce evidence of his previous public statements. Furthermore, Isabella continued, pressing her advantage, I was legally sold by my guardian after being declared unmarried and available for placement. Mr. Steele purchased me in good faith, based on accurate information provided by my family. If Jonathan wants to claim otherwise, he'll need to take that up with my stepmother, who represented my legal status at the time of sale. The mention of Cordelia brought a slight smile to Isabella's lips. The woman who had orchestrated her sale would now have to defend her actions to Jonathan. A confrontation that would benefit no one but Isabella herself. Jacob stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had impressed Isabella from their first meeting. Gentlemen, it seems like there are legal questions here that can't be resolved in my front yard. Sheriff, I suggest you return to town and sort this out through proper channels. In the meantime, Miss Crenshaw is under my protection, and I won't allow her to be taken against her will based on questionable documentation. Jonathan's face had turned an alarming shade of red. You can't defy a legal order, Steele. I'm not defying anything, Jacob replied calmly. I'm asking for proper legal process instead of frontier justice based on convenient paperwork. If your claim is legitimate, prove it in court. Until then, Isabella stays here. The confrontation reached its climax when Jonathan, frustrated by his inability to simply take what he considered his property, made a crucial mistake. This is ridiculous, he shouted. I'm not going to be lectured about legal process by some dirt farmer who buys women like livestock. Isabella, you will come with me now, or I'll have you dragged back to town in chains. The threat was the wrong move at the wrong time. Sheriff Coleman stepped back, clearly unwilling to participate in forcible abduction based on questionable legal documents. More importantly, Jonathan's words revealed his true character to everyone present, including his own companion, who looked embarrassed by the display. Mr. Westbrook, Sheriff Coleman said firmly, I think you'd best return to town and sort this out through proper legal channels. I'm not prepared to force anyone to go anywhere based on documents that seem to contradict other evidence. Jonathan realized he had overplayed his hand, but his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat gracefully. This isn't over, Steele, he snarled. I'll be back with proper authority, and when I return, you'll pay for interfering with my family affairs. As the three men mounted their horses and rode away, Isabella felt her knees go weak with relief. The immediate threat had passed, but she knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Jonathan would return with better legal preparation, and the next confrontation might not end so favorably. Jacob put a steadying hand on her shoulder. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Before Isabella could respond, three small bodies burst through the front door and surrounded her with fierce embraces. Emma, Thomas, and Sarah clung to her as if afraid she might disappear if they let go. We thought you were leaving, Thomas said, his voice muffled against her dress. We thought everyone was leaving again, Emma added, her usual hostility replaced by desperate vulnerability. Sarah said nothing, but her tiny arms squeezed Isabella with surprising strength. Isabella knelt down to gather all three children into a proper embrace, feeling the full weight of their trust and dependence. I'm not going anywhere, she promised them. Whatever happens, I'm not leaving you. But even as she spoke the words, Isabella knew that keeping that promise might prove more difficult than she had imagined. Jonathan would return, probably with better legal representation and more compelling documentation. The question was whether she would have enough time to prepare her own defense. or whether the next confrontation would end with her being dragged back to a life that had already nearly destroyed her. For now, though, she had won a crucial battle. She had stood up to Jonathan, exposed the weaknesses in his legal strategy, and proven to herself and the children that she was no longer the helpless woman who had been sold in Copper Ridge's market square. Whatever came next, she would meet it as a person who had found her strength and learned to fight for what mattered most. 2 days after Jonathan's failed attempt to reclaim Isabella, the real test of loyalty and courage arrived not in the form of legal documents or threatening words, but as an orange glow on the distant horizon that meant only one thing in the dry, Arizona territory. Wildfire. Jacob spotted it first during his evening inspection of the cattle, a flickering light that grew steadily brighter against the darkening sky. By the time he galloped back to the ranch house, the wind had shifted, carrying the acrid smell of smoke and the terrifying sound of flames consuming everything in their path. "Prairie fire!" Jacob shouted as he burst through the front door, his face grim with the knowledge of what this meant. Moving fast from the South Ridge. "We've got maybe 2 hours before it reaches the ranch." Isabella had read about prairie fires in newspaper accounts, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of facing one. The approaching inferno would consume everything in its pathgrass, trees, buildings, livestock, and people who couldn't escape in time. In the frontier territories, fire was more feared than drought, disease, or Indian raids because it gave no quarter and left nothing behind. Emma immediately took charge of her younger siblings with the efficiency of someone who had faced emergencies before. "Thomas, get the emergency supplies from the root cellar. Sarah, help me gather the important papers from Papa's desk." Her voice was steady, but Isabella could see the fear in the 12-year-old's eyes. The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. Jacob and his ranch hands worked frantically to move the cattle to safer ground, driving the herd toward the river where they might survive if the fire passed quickly. Isabella found herself coordinating the household evacuation, packing essential supplies and helping the children prepare for what might be a long flight from their home. But as they loaded the wagon with their belongings, a new crisis emerged that would test every bond they had formed over the past month. Thomas had disappeared. "He was helping with the papers," Emma said, her voice tight with panic. "Then I sent him to get his clothes, but he never came back." Isabella's heart stopped as she realized what must have happened. Thomas, the sensitive 9-year-old who blamed himself for his mother's death, had probably gone to retrieve something precious from the house, perhaps a memento of Mary that he couldn't bear to leave behind. "The house is already too dangerous," Jacob said grimly, returning from the barn where he'd been preparing the horses. "The wind's pushing the fire faster than I thought. We need to leave now." "Thomas is still inside," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Jacob's face went white. "Where?" "Probably his room, looking for something of his mother's," Isabella replied, already moving toward the house. "I'm going after him." "No." Jacob grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "I'll go. You get Emma and Sarah to safety." But Emma stepped forward, her young face set with determination that made her look far older than her 12 years. "Miss, Isabella knows the house better now. She knows where Thomas would go, what he'd be looking for. And you're the only one who can manage the horses if they panic." The logic was sound, but the risk was enormous. The fire was less than a mile away now, close enough that they could hear the roar of flames and see sparks dancing in the smoke-filled air. Going back into the house was potentially suicidal. Isabella looked at Sarah, who was crying silently while clutching her doll, and at Emma, whose fierce expression couldn't quite hide her terror. These children had already lost their mother. They couldn't lose their brother too, and they couldn't lose another woman who had promised to stay. "I'll find him," Isabella said firmly, pulling away from Jacob's restraining hand. "Get the girls to the river crossing." If I'm not back in 15 minutes, don't wait." Before anyone could argue further, Isabella ran toward the house, her skirts hampering her progress but her determination driving her forward. Behind her, she could hear Jacob shouting instructions to his men and Emma's voice calling encouragement, but her attention was focused entirely on the task ahead. The house was already filling with smoke, making each breath a struggle. Isabella called Thomas's name as she climbed the stairs, her voice competing with the growing roar of the approaching fire. The heat was becoming oppressive, and she knew they had very little time before the building became a death trap. She found Thomas in his parents' bedroom, kneeling beside the bed and frantically searching through a wooden chest that contained Mary's personal belongings. Tears streamed down his soot-stained face as he pulled out letters, photographs, and small trinkets, unable to decide what was most important to save. "I can't choose," he sobbed when he saw Isabella. "I can't leave Mama's things behind, but I can't carry them all." Isabella knelt beside him, her heart breaking at the sight of this little boy trying to preserve his mother's memory while the world burned around them. She could have simply grabbed him and run, but she understood that what Thomas was trying to save was more than just objects. It was his connection to the woman who had given his life meaning. "What would your mama want you to save most?" Isabella asked gently. Even as the smoke grew thicker and the heat became almost unbearable, Thomas held up a small music box that played a gentle lullaby when opened. "She used to wind us every night and let it play while she tucked us in," he whispered. "She said the music would keep us safe while we slept." "Then that's what we take," Isabella said firmly, helping him to his feet. "Your mama's love isn't in her things, Thomas. It's in your memories, in the way she raised you, in the person you're becoming. But if this music box helps you remember that love, then it's the most important thing in the world." They ran from the burning house together, Thomas clutching the music box while Isabella guided him through the smoke-filled rooms toward the front door. Behind them, she could hear the ominous cracking of wooden beams beginning to fail under the heat. They emerged from the house just as Jacob returned with the wagon, his face a mask of relief and terror. Without a word, he lifted Thomas into the wagon and helped Isabella climb up beside the children, then whipped the horses into a gallop toward the river crossing. The race against the fire became a nightmare of smoke, sparks, and desperate speed. The wind drove the flames across the grassland with terrifying efficiency, consuming everything they had worked to build. Isabella held the children close as they bounced across the rough terrain, watching their home disappear behind a wall of orange destruction. They reached the river crossing just as the fire crested the ridge behind the ranch buildings. From their safe position on the far bank, they watched helplessly as the flames consumed the barn, the outbuildings, and finally the house itself. Everything Jacob and Mary had built together was being reduced to ash and memory. But as Isabella looked around at the small group huddled together beside the river, Jacob with his arms around his children, the ranch hands who had risked their lives to save the cattle, and herself, no longer an outsider but an integral part of this makeshift family, she realized that the most important things had been saved. Thomas opened his music box, and the gentle lullaby played softly in the smoky air, a reminder that love endures even when everything else burns away. Sarah leaned against Isabella's side, her small hand finding comfort in the familiar touch. Emma stood close to her father, but her eyes remained fixed on Isabella with an expression of gratitude and something deeper acceptance. "What do we do now?" Emma asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the distant roar of the fire. Jacob looked at his destroyed ranch, then at his children, and finally at Isabella. When he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised everyone, including himself. "We rebuild," he said simply. "Together." The word "together" carried more weight than any legal document or marriage certificate ever could. It was a promise, a commitment, and a recognition that they had become something more than just people thrown together by circumstance. They had become a family, forged not by blood or law but by choice, loyalty, and the courage to save what mattered most. As the fire burned itself out against the river, leaving behind a blackened landscape that would eventually regenerate, Isabella understood that sometimes destruction cleared the way for new growth. The life she had known was gone, just as the ranch buildings were gone, but what they would build together would be stronger because it was built on the foundation of tested love and proven commitment. The children fell asleep against her in the pre-dawn hours, exhausted by fear and trauma, but secure in the knowledge that they were still together. Jacob dozed fitfully, his body finally allowing rest now that his family was safe. And Isabella watched the sun rise over the devastated landscape, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring, because she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. 5 years after the fire that destroyed the Steel Ranch, Isabella stood on the wraparound porch of the new house, watching her family prepare for the most important celebration of their lives. The rebuilt ranch was larger and more prosperous than the original, but more importantly, it had become a true home in ways that the first house never could have been. The occasion was Emma's 16th birthday, but it had transformed into something far more significant, a gathering that would bring together everyone who had played a role in their unconventional family's journey from desperation to joy. Thomas, now 14 and nearly as tall as his father, was helping Jacob string lanterns between the porch posts. The serious boy who had once carried the weight of his mother's death on his shoulders had grown into a young man who understood that grief was not something to be conquered, but something to be integrated into a life lived fully. His mother's music box still sat on his dresser, but now it shared space with books about engineering and agriculture, evidence of a future he was actively building. Sarah, 11 years old, and full of the laughter that had returned to her voice, was directing the placement of wildflowers she had gathered from the meadow that had grown back after the fire. The silent little girl who had once hidden from the world now possessed an infectious joy that drew people to her like sunlight draws flowers. She called Isabella Mama Bella without any self-consciousness, a name that had evolved naturally from their years together, and Emma Beautiful. Strong-willed Emma was transformed from an angry, grief-stricken girl into a young woman who had learned that loving someone new didn't diminish the love she felt for the mother she had lost. She wore her grandmother's pearl necklace and her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, but she also wore a new dress that Isabella had sewn for her, a perfect symbol of honoring the past while embracing the present. The guests arriving for the celebration represented the community that had grown around their family. Neighboring ranchers who had helped them rebuild, the schoolteacher who had become Emma's mentor, and ranch hands who had stayed not just for work, but because they were treated as family rather than hired help. But the most significant arrival was Sheriff Coleman, who brought with him news that would finally close the chapter on Isabella's past. He approached the porch with a formal document in his hand, his expression mixing official duty with personal satisfaction. "Mrs. Steele," he said, using the name that Isabella had taken not through marriage, but through the deeper bonds of chosen family, "I have something that belongs to you." The document was a legal declaration that invalidated all of Jonathan Westbrook's claims to Isabella, citing abandonment, fraud, and the territorial court's recognition of her current family situation as legitimate. Jonathan himself had been forced to abandon his pursuit when his financial troubles and personal scandals made him a pariah in Copper Ridge society. "It's over," Sheriff Coleman said simply. "You're free to live your life without looking over your shoulder." But Isabella had already been free for years. The legal resolution was satisfying, but it couldn't match the liberation she had found in becoming someone who mattered, who was needed, who had built something beautiful from the ashes of her former life. As the evening celebration began, Isabella found herself standing apart for a moment, watching her family and friends gather around tables laden with food she had prepared with Emma's help. The scene was everything she had never dared to dream during those dark months, when her stepmother had systematically destroyed her spirit. Jacob appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist with the comfortable familiarity of a partnership that had been tested by fire and proven stronger than either of them had imagined possible. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the gentle humor that had helped them through the darkest times. "Only one," Isabella replied, leaning into his warmth. "I wish I could go back and tell that broken woman in the market square that being sold was the best thing that ever happened to her." "She wouldn't have believed you," Jacob observed. "Sometimes we have to live our way into understanding rather than thinking our way into it." Emma approached them, carrying a wrapped package with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for precious objects. "Mama Bella," she said, using the name that had become natural over the years. "This is from all of us." Inside the package was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. On the first page, someone had written in careful script, "For the woman who taught us that families aren't just born, they're built by people brave enough to love beyond blood." Below that, in 3 different handwritings, were messages from each of the children. Emma had written, "Thank you for showing me that honoring Mama meant learning to love again." Thomas had added, "You saved more than my life in that fire, you saved my future." And Sarah, in her careful child script, had written, "You kept your promise to stay." Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. Understanding that this gift represented more than gratitude, it was recognition of the role she had played in healing a broken family and building something new from the fragments of loss. The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and the kind of joy that comes from people who have survived hardship together. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Isabella found herself once again on the porch. But this time she wasn't alone. Sarah had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by excitement and happiness. Thomas sat nearby, reading by lamplight with the focused intensity he had inherited from his father. Emma was inside, helping Jacob with the cleanup, their voices carrying the easy conversation of people who had learned to work together. This was her legacy, not the children she had never born, but the young people she had helped to heal. Not the marriage that had failed, but the family that had succeeded beyond all expectations. Not the woman who had been sold like livestock, but the woman who had been strong enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Years later, when visitors asked about the unusual family structure at the prosperous steel ranch, the answer was always the same. Love, they would learn, wasn't about blood or law or social convention. It was about choice, commitment, and the courage to believe that broken people could create something beautiful when they found the right place to belong. Isabella Crenshaw had been sold because she couldn't bear children, but Isabella Steele had built a family that would endure for generations, not through birth, but through the deeper bonds of love, tested by fire, and proven stronger than any force that tried to break it. In the end, that was the greatest revenge against those who had declared her worthless, not bitterness or anger, but a life so full of love and purpose that their cruelty became irrelevant. She had been sold for her failures, but she had been reborn through her capacity to heal, to nurture, and to love without conditions or expectations. The woman who had once stood in a market square, humiliated and powerless, now stood on her own land, surrounded by a family that had chosen her as completely as she had chosen them. And that, she knew, was worth more than any price that had ever been paid.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.